In this week's All-Consuming Grace podcast, hosts Paul and Rebecca Turner continue with part 5 in the series Difficult Relationships When Grace Becomes Visible, with a powerful turning point when grace creates loyalty. After walking through the pain, fractures, and realities of broken relationships in previous episodes, this conversation shifts the focus forward. What happens when God's all-consuming grace not only heals, but binds hearts together in something deeper than natural connection? Paul and Rebecca explore how grace forms a profound bond among those who are fully surrendered to what God is doing. This is not surface-level friendship or convenient companionship. It is a spirit-forged loyalty, one that often surpasses even familial ties. When believers walk in shared surrender, shared purpose, shared grace, they find themselves drawn into relationships marked by trust, defense, and unwavering commitment. This episode highlights how grace moves us beyond survival mode and into intentional connection. Instead of being defined by past wounds, we begin to recognize and pursue the relationships God is building in the present. These are the people we stand with, fight for, and remain faithful to. Not because it is easy, but because grace has made it necessary. As the series reaches this pivotal moment, Paul and Rebecca remind listeners that God's grace doesn't just restore what was broken, it creates something entirely new. A loyalty rooted in Him, a closeness shaped by surrender, a fellowship that reflects the very heart of Christ. This is the beauty of all-consuming grace. It doesn't just heal relationships, it redefines them.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the All-Consuming Grace podcast. Paul and Rebecca here, back together again. Say hello, Rebecca, my lovely wife.
I could say hello this
You
week.
can.
We didn't have a podcast last week because we've been sick.
I know. I was going to apologize. And we almost didn't get one in this week because you shared. How
Right.
dare you share with your husband? And so she didn't have a voice last week. I barely had one a couple days ago, or I sounded...
Maybe you still sound that way. I don't know.
I probably do sound that way a little bit, but I sound a lot better than
Yeah.
I did 2 or 3 days ago. So we are glad to be on the mend and being able to sit down and share this. And so
There still was a podcast up last week, though.
the Guide Service had a podcast.
Yes, the Guide
up.
Service podcast.
So if you didn't listen to that, share it with your husbands. If your husbands or men in your life, share it with them. It really is challenging men to think biblically, not just get our theology down, but to actually think and process things through the lens of the Word of God. Make decisions based on what God's Word says, not just what prevailing winds prefer at any one moment. But I want to share with you a story.
Okay.
And I will try and keep this brief. I make no promises, but it's a very important backdrop to this story. Your life was threatened in 2008, I believe. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. I don't remember the year.
And now you're wondering, what does this have to do with anything?
I'm a little curious.
It was, I believe it was 2008. We had a gentleman... I use that word loosely, that we had been ministering to off and on through the years. He lived next door in a house where you rent a room and everybody kind of shares the common areas. And he was inebriated and probably
Drunk
and probably high. And he was out on the roof.
Right.
And
it was dangerous.
Yes, his life was in danger, and somebody called the cops. Not to get him in trouble, just so that he would be safe, so that somebody would get him down off the roof. He thought that was you. It was not you, but he called and left a message basically saying, don't go to sleep tonight.
Yeah.
And at that point...
that was terrifying.
Yeah. We had small children at the time. We ended up staying in a hotel for a couple nights. He got evicted. And so then we returned after that. And for a while, we were quite...
Makes you a little
paranoid,
uneasy,
a little nervous about this gentleman wandering the neighborhood. And so we determined at that point we were going to move. We were living in the parsonage, but we were going to move. We wanted to live in the country. Found out very quickly we had debts. We were living the American dream. We had a car payment and some other debts, and knew we couldn't afford a house payment on my salary. with the debt that we had. So we had to get out of debt. It took us 10 months to pay off all the debt we had. And in the process of that, I had been searching for houses, but we knew we weren't going to put a down payment. We weren't going to buy a house until we were debt free. And I believe God's hand was in this. Otherwise, we have to worship and give credit to the God of just coincidence and happenstance. And
I'm going to choose God every time.
Yeah, me too. And so we ended up buying, how would you describe it? A fixer-upper, nigh unto blower-upper.
Yeah.
And just to set the stage for this, it was 3.5 acres, and it had a house, a septic, 4-year-old septic, and a 10-year-old well. So the land value alone was worth more. We paid $32,600. This was on the heels of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the housing collapse. And so we got a stellar deal. I remember our real estate agent saying, "This looks like Little House on the Prairie."
Yeah. Well, because it looked like a prairie, because the grasses were up to your, almost above your head.
Yeah, it was neck deep grass. And so the neighbor actually came over and bailed it. And we lived in a pop-up camper while we remodeled, and every day was spent tearing out walls and tearing off things and roof trusses and walls and all kinds of things, and starting almost from the foundation up. But, and we did that all for cash as we had money. But the point in all of that is, as we were going through that, there were a lot of decisions and hardships. You were pregnant at one point in that whole process, living in the pop-up camper. It was getting cold. And I remember people from church would come out once in a while and offer to help. And I was always grateful for the help. But more than one man came through helping. And as he would be getting ready to leave for the day, I can remember this on multiple occasions, say, "My wife would never do this." And it wasn't like their wives were all prim and proper.
Oh, right.
It was just, it was roughing it. I mean, it was roughing it.
It really was.
And we'd been married about 10 or 11 years at the time when we started that whole, where we still live today. And yet, here we stand. How many years have we been married now? 2026. We're coming up on, this is 29 years this year.
I was waiting to see if you got it right.
Yeah. Just for the record, for everybody out there listening, I usually get it right faster than she does. But so we've been at this 18 years here. Wow. 18 years. Anyway, that whole process, all that work, all that backbreaking labor, financial hardships and difficulties along the way, it really brought us closer together. And I think while all couples wouldn't do this, I think if a couple approaches going through difficulties and hardships together as an opportunity to grow and sees it in that light, it really is. I believe we are closer today because of the path we took and the decisions we made than we would have been if we had just taken the traditional, let's just go the traditional route of buying a house. And we had to work through those things.
Yeah.
And all of that to say, what we're going to talk about today with God's grace is when you go through things with people are drawn closer together. The whole point of our podcast is the grace of God needs to consume our lives, right?
Right.
And so when the grace of God consumes us, when we really learn to walk in the grace of God in every area of our life, it draws us closer to one another. And you really only need grace when there are difficulties, when there are hardships, and you're going through those things. I can think of, going back just briefly here to our house. I remember one time you left with the little ones, went into town, you had to get a few things, and we were working on it. And when you left, there were roof trusses and walls, and you came back like 4 hours later, and I had removed, you knew the roof trusses were coming off, but when you came back, the walls were gone. And I think you were in a little bit of shock. because it wasn't what you were expecting, but you probably had to maybe show some grace in that moment. It could have been very disturbing or upsetting to you, but I think we need to learn a little bit about how grace really brings us together, draws us to one another, and helps us to strengthen our relationships. In the previous episodes, what were some of the things we looked at in the previous episodes?
Well, we looked at Peter and the fact that Peter had failed. He had some blind spots there. We talked about him denying Christ and everything. And yet, when Jesus sits down with him, he says, "Do you love me?" And he comes at Peter's failure not from a scolding aspect or whatever, but he helps to restore Peter. And I think we saw in that episode that grace seeks to restore and not emphasize people's failures necessarily.
Right. And the thing with that too is it was backward looking.
Right. Right. And then I remember I was going to say this too, like Joseph, we looked at the life of Joseph, and, he dealt with betrayal by his family members. His brothers had completely betrayed him. I mean, they had done some really awful things to him. And yet God's grace, I think you can even see how that was working in Joseph's life, because it took a lot of years, but he was able to look back on everything that had been done to him, and it really reframed his story. He was able to look at it from God's perspective and see, God had a plan through this.
And both of those things, when you're working through relationships, when you're working through situations, and you want God's grace to really be all-consuming,
right,
you have to address those. You have to see through those things. You have to have the event that you're going through reframed in your thinking.
Right.
But at some point, and really what we want to do in this episode is really put those things in the rearview mirror. We've looked at those things, and when you're processing a situation, you are going to address the failures.
Right.
You are going to
deal with the pain of betrayal, grieve, probably.
Yes, and you have to allow yourself to do those things.
You have to allow God's grace to work in God's time in those situations.
Yeah. And you can't see that as failure, like, I just can't let go. I just can't move on. I mean, you have to allow everybody heals at their own pace working through those things. There's no set timeline. Well, it's been 30 days. Okay, move on.
Right.
But now what we need to do, at least for the sake of the podcast, even though steps 1 and 2 may take some time, put those things in the rearview mirror and say, okay, now let's look at going forward. How does the pain that we've been through, how does that affect us going forward? And really what you see is it begins to transform. It has the potential to transform that relationship where there has been difficulty.
It can.
But it also has the potential to affect how we interact in other relationships for the honor and glory of God.
Right. I think what the all-consuming grace of God does in our lives, and look, this is true whether, I don't want people to think we're only talking about traumatic past relationships. Really, any relationships. Whatever you've been through, we're going through life, we're going through a growing process. When we start to understand the grace of God and really what that is, and that it needs to be all-consuming, and we've talked a lot about what the grace of God is. When we are allowing the grace of God to transform our lives, it's at that point we begin to know what is possible in real relationships.
That's a really good way to say that.
Just see, wow, what can the grace of God do in my relationships with other people? They don't have to be bad relationships. So we're not necessarily talking about conflict here. We're not talking about reconciling past failed relationships. We're just talking about in everyday life. grace helps us see what is possible. And I think as we look through this account today, we're going to look at David and Jonathan.
Right.
And the kind of relationship that says, I'm going to set myself aside and I'm going to, I'm going to follow what is God's best. I want what is going to make God glorified and so on. So we go through that. It's a great example of that kind of relationship that I think we should all be desiring.
Yeah, for all of the problems in David and Jonathan's life, David and Jonathan always had a great relationship.
Right. And in 1 Samuel chapter 18, where we're first introduced to, basically where David and Jonathan's relationship really begins.
Mm-hmm.
David's in Saul's army. He's the mighty man, and he comes back from battle, right? He comes back from battle and he's recounting what he has seen, what he has done, and
this is actually right after he kills Goliath. That's the events leading up to this.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's the specific situation. But he comes back and he's like, here's what God did. This is the account. And Jonathan's hearing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan's hearing all of this, and it says there in 1 Samuel 18 verse 1, and it came to pass when David made an end of speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul.
Yeah, I mean, there is this togetherness there that they are brought together, and it's important to understand what this is going to set up, because their relationship is going to grow from here.
Right.
Because while they have a great relationship, there's going to be turmoil around them.
Right.
I mean, Jonathan's father is the king, and Saul starts to have issues here. I mean, he already has some issues.
Right.
At this point, it would be wise to say David's already been anointed by Samuel to be the next king.
Right.
But Saul's still king.
Yeah.
And that's not widely known. I mean, that's not information that's out there among the general population at the time. And so David is just being obedient to God.
Right.
And that's where the conflict is really going to come in this. David's being obedient to God, and Jonathan resonates with that.
Right.
And what's the verse say?
They're knit together.
Yeah, and his soul.
Right.
At a soul level. That's what I think God's grace can do, is it really can bring about a deep relationship at a soul level, not just superficial relationships like are so often in this world.
Right.
And a lot of times familial relationships are very superficial.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Just because you're blood related to someone does not mean that you automatically have some sort of, spiritual unity or, that connection on that deeper level. And that's what we see here with Jonathan and David. I mean, when it comes down to it, as followers of Christ, if I understand how God's grace can transform a life,
Mm-hmm.
I find that I really want to have relationships with people that mirror what the Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 2, verse 2.
Right.
He said, that you be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. And I really think that's what you see between David and Jonathan. It's what Paul is talking about. I mean, Paul met a lot of people. A lot of people knew him in a lot of different cities because he traveled around and he preached and he spent time with these people. But, Paul could say, wow, I got a lot of friends. But what Paul's heart desire was, I don't just want you know, just these surface relationships. I know that I really want relationships with people where we are like-minded and we're of one accord. Like we share the same love.
And social media has really corrupted that idea even more. You Facebook, you have friends.
Yeah.
Instagram, you have, are those friends or followers? I can never remember. But what does friends denote? Friendship, denote relationship. And yet a lot of times, some of these people you don't really even know other
Right.
than I know their name and what they post.
Right.
And followers denote, if they're following you, then you are a leader,
Yeah.
I guess.
I know.
I don't know. So it's even cheapened that
You're an
idea.
influencer.
Oh, influencer, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
But the whole idea of a deep relationship is something that in many ways is foreign to our thinking today societally.
Right. But when we understand God's grace and we've allowed God's grace to consume our lives, then it's only within that context that we can have unity, whether it's in a marriage or it is in, a relationship with other believers that is deeply rooted in a shared submission to God's will. I think that's what Paul was talking about in Philippians 2:2.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we only talk to people who we're in that close relationship with, but God's grace shows us that it's possible to have those kind of relationships with other people.
Do you think that that's part of the downfall of churches today, is that there's not that Philippians 2:2 mentality among people in the body, in that local assembly?
Right.
Especially if,
well, I think if we're talking about loyalty, and I think in David and Jonathan's life, you see a loyalty, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a sec. But you're right. Probably that is maybe part of the problem that can arise because the loyalty is not to those that are like-minded, to developing a connection based on shared submission to God. It's a loyalty to the gang or a loyalty to this building, this place.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Because try to leave.
Yeah.
Try to leave the gang. You're going to be tracked down. You're going to be dragged through the mud. It's like, what is your loyalty to? And I think that should be a red flag.
Sure.
Do I really have that kind of deep spiritual connection? Are we unified here in the way that God intended when he says we are all members of the same body and we are here to exhort and edify one another?
I think a lot of times those two things that you mentioned are conflated. Loyalty to the institution is conflated with
loyalty to the body.
Right.
Right.
And yet I think there are people, I know there are people within the body of Christ who attend churches, who attend, local assemblies, who don't have the Philippians 2:2.
Right.
But who crave it, desire it,
right.
want it.
Absolutely.
But can't seem to find it there.
Right.
And that, what that means is, I suppose what I would say is if you can't find it there, then you need to be the one that goes after it there.
Right.
Develop it there.
Right.
Let
Absolutely.
others see what that looks like.
Right. Because I think when we're looking at God's grace influencing and completely changing our lives, it should produce within us a desire to surrender. Surrender our own desire for comfort, surrender our own, ideas about things, being willing to, like it also says in Philippians, esteem others better than ourselves. And so when you start to develop, when you can spot these people. And it's so refreshing to have a friend that is one, they're like-minded. You share a submission to God's will. You want to follow Christ in every aspect of your life.
And so do they.
And so do they. And you are so surrendered to the will of God that when it comes to that other person, and I mean, really, the marriage relationship should be the most obvious example of this.
Should be.
But you can see it in other relationships.
Yes.
You hopefully can see it in other relationships as well. But a surrender of your personal rights, a surrender of your own ambitions. And Christ is our example of that. Because in Philippians chapter 2, it says, let this mind be in you, which was in him. I mean, he surrendered his own rights.
Yeah.
He became a servant. He humbled himself. That's the kind of deep connected relationship that grace makes possible. That is only possible through the grace of God.
And really what you see is a loyalty to one another. But that loyalty is only in existence because you have two people who are like-minded, who are living out Philippians 2:2, who put themselves aside and are completely committed to whatever Christ would have, and therefore they are loyal to one another. But that loyalty could go away if one chooses to walk away from God.
Right.
You
Absolutely.
walk away from God, and it's going to destroy the depth of of the relationship between those two people.
Right. And going back to David and Jonathan, Jonathan's soul, what's it say there? His soul was knit together with David's soul. But in verse 4, it says, Jonathan, he took off his own robe. He gave it to David, his garments, his sword, his bow, his girdle. I mean, really, Jonathan is giving to David the things that signify who Jonathan is. It's like Jonathan is the king's son.
Right. He's the heir apparent. He's the heir apparent.
Right. By human standards, he should be the next in line to be king. You would just kind of assume that to be the case. And yet, Jonathan, I'm not saying Jonathan understood everything. He knew everything. But we can at least surmise enough from this to see that Jonathan recognized that he cared deeply enough about David that he would bestow on David all of the things that made him who he was, that made him stand out among all of the people. He was basically, it looks like he is willing, and you have to kind of get more into the story, and we don't have time to read all those chapters today, but it's like he's saying, I am willing to surrender my position, my identity, my future claim to the throne. I'm not saying in that moment he understands all of that, but as this story unfolds, you see that attitude in Jonathan.
You really see him giving up he's less loyal to his family. When he sees what God is, I think really what you see is what God is doing through David. When Jonathan recognizes that, he is more loyal to what God is doing through David than he is to his own family.
Right.
And with that, giving up his identity as Saul's son.
And this might maybe hit a little close to home, I think especially with people who serve in, maybe they're pastors or they serve in ministry, maybe they're elders or, I mean, it could come, it could be a lot of different, even national ministry type things. But when you understand the grace of God, what the grace of God has done in your life,
yes,
how the grace of God can transform someone's life. And once that grace is all consuming, I think a test of that in your own life is, has your desire for self-promotion been completely destroyed? Like, I think in relationships with others, when grace has consumed you, when it has transformed you, it kills all self-promotion.
Yeah.
Like you no longer are like, hey, it's like Jonathan. He's not over here going, remember me? I'm the king's son.
Yeah.
He's saying, no, here, David, you take all these robes. God's at work in your life, and I want to do everything I can to help you fulfill God's will for your life. And that's the kind of relationships that grace makes possible. I mean, those are beautiful relationships.
And really what you see going forward, it's great to see this established in 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 and 4. You really start to see that relationship, that bond, that loyalty because of Jonathan's decisions and David's faithfulness.
Right.
Because what you see going forward is Saul tries to kill David. Everybody remembers that, chucking the spear at him. But then there's a couple other times where, Saul gives his daughter to David to wife, and you think, well, now Jonathan and David are in-laws, right?
Right.
But what was the motive behind that? When you read in 1 Samuel 18, I think it's verse 20, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. Basically he sets him up because ultimately Saul is trying to get David killed.
Yeah.
He already tried to give him, I think, his other daughter. I think that was previously in the chapter. And he sends him out to get the foreskins of the Philistines. And when you read it in the context, he was literally trying to get David killed.
Yeah, Saul hates David.
Right. And so over and over again, he's trying to lay a snare. This goes back to our series on abuse, but this really ties in because, listen, we live in a world where abuse takes place today. There's bad situations going on around us all the time. We live in a fallen, sin-cursed world. But when you find those others who are going the same direction that God is going, and you're headed together in ministry or in marriage or in family or in friendship, whatever that relationship is, that's where those bonds are strengthened because you're going through the storms of life together, and those relationships are being strengthened every day by God's grace.
Right. And the relationship that Jonathan was forming with David was going to be, it's costly.
Yes.
It's costly. Because he's choosing David over even family loyalty. This is a difficult thing, but again, back to grace. Grace produces a relationship, makes possible a relationship. So only through the grace of God can you have a relationship where it's not based on, proximity, or situations. Maybe it's not always all that convenient, but it's such a strong bond that it's not easily abandoned, to the point where I think what you see, probably the thing that I think we would all hope for, standing in contrast to what we saw with Peter, how he denied Jesus, is the fact that in 1 Samuel 19, it says that Jonathan spoke good of David to Saul, his father. And that would have really been putting it on the line.
Yeah.
He speaks
Wouldn't it,
good.
though?
He defends David's character. He's willing to speak up and say, hey, David, he has the best of intent. This is a good guy. And he defends David's character, and he intercedes on David's behalf, risking his own standing in the kingdom.
So what you're saying is that grace is not, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut.
No. And I think we've addressed that in other podcasts on other issues.
Yeah, you can't remain silent when others are attacked.
Right.
And we've seen our share of that in different situations where it's important for others to speak up.
Right. And that comes in the context of those relationships that have been formed around a shared submission to God's will.
Right. And
I think the whole, there's so many different things that that you could talk about, but we're not talking about temporary alliances here. We're not talking about, I'm friends with you, now we're going to unfriend you. We are talking about the kind of relationship that closely mirrors the kind of relationship that Christ has with his body. And those are the kinds of relationships that we should be seeking to develop with other people, because it's within the context of those relationships, these commitments to one another around the truth of God's word, that are going to endure the seasons. They're going to endure the storms. They're going to grow as a result of that. And so, like, we can look back, probably all of us in our past, and see failed relationships.
Right.
We can look back and we can see places where we've been betrayed, maybe by friends, maybe by family. I mean, we can look back and see that. But grace makes it possible to form relationships that mirror Christ's relationship with the church, the body of Christ. And that is beautiful. That's a beautiful thing.
And really, I said that goes in everything we've talked about in the past episodes becomes the rearview mirror. And as you go forward, what you start to see is you start to look at, these are the types of relationships I want.
Right.
This is the depth of relationship that I want with people. I don't want shallow relationships. I don't want superficial relationships. I don't want situational relationships. And you know what's interesting? When you start to take that shift mentally, when grace starts to shift your mind and you see I'm capable of having this type of relationship. These type of relationships are capable. We can have this.
They're possible.
Yeah, they're possible. You start to want them, and you start to not want superficial relationships.
Right.
And what happens is sometimes there are those in your life who just want the superficial relationships. And so there's a winnowing process there.
Right. And so when it comes down to it, if you look at this biblical account,
Mm-hmm.
Saul, the king, the leader of the people, he saw David as a threat.
Right.
And it caused him to treat David in a way that, led to Saul's self-promotion. And, I don't want this kid to come in and take over, and, whatever. And he even tried to kill David. So Saul saw David as a threat. Jonathan, the difference is that Jonathan saw David as part of God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so the difference wasn't, well, Jonathan, was a nicer guy than his dad or whatever. The difference is grace. The difference is being able to see what God is doing, allowing who God is to transform our relationships and to leave us with relationships that are all consumed by the grace of God.
Thank you so much for listening to the All Consuming Grace podcast. We are grateful that you've taken the time to join us today. If this episode encouraged you, please take a moment to like, follow, and share our podcast channel so others can discover the message of God's grace as well. This podcast is a ministry of Bible Doctrines to Live By, with our home office located in Comstock Park, Michigan, a suburb of the greater Grand Rapids area. If you'd like to connect with us, you can email Paul or Rebecca at pault@bibledoctrines.org. You can learn more about the podcast at www.allconsuminggrace.org or visit our ministry website at www.bibledoctrines.org. If you're interested in having us visit your church, we'd love to hear from you. We host ladies' conferences and marriage conferences, and we're always looking for churches who would like to partner with us in hosting future events. We love you all. Until the next time, live in His all-consuming grace.